Hey folks, Pastor Hans here, and thanks for tuning in to this edition of this study that we're calling Making Sense of Revelation. The book of Revelation, you know this, it's probably the most confusing, strangest, it's a weird book of the Bible that has been misinterpreted more often than any other book of the Bible. As we begin today, here's what I want to remind you. This book is not a book meant to instill fear. In fact, this book was meant to be Christ's love letter to people like you and people like me. In fact, in the very first chapter, verse 17 of the book of Revelation, it's loud and clear. It has the words of Jesus saying to people like you, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. So in chapter 2 and chapter 3, the author, using the words of Christ, is addressing 7 churches in that ancient world. All 7 of these churches had faced one form of persecution or another. But in chapter 2, which we looked at in the last episode, the author, through the words of Christ, is addressing the churches in Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, and Thyatira. And each of those churches faced unique situations. They had unique dynamics going on within the church, and Christ had a special message for each one of them, a message of hope, a message of peace, a message that would bring their lives, give their lives a whole lot more hope and joy. And I hope as you heard those in the last episode, you found yourself maybe in one of those churches. Those were the first 4 churches. Today, in chapter 3, we're going to take a look at the final 3 churches. The author, using the words of Christ, addresses the church in Sardis. Now, the church in Sardis was located in a unique spot. It was located near a river that was filled with gold. And so this community was a community of abundance. And because of its abundance, it was this metropolitan community. People from all over landed in Sardis. And so the church was known for its diversity. Not only was it known for its diversity, but it was known for its tolerance. Now, tolerance is a great thing. It's a great thing as long as it doesn't lead to indifference. And what the author seems to suggest is in Sardis, their tolerance had led them to sort of falling asleep, to playing it safe, to sort of holding their cards back. In fact, in chapter 3, verse 2, it says this, "Wake up!" You see, the people of the church in Sardis had fallen asleep. "Wake up and strengthen what remains and is on the point of death, for I have not found your works perfect in the sight of my God. Remember then what you have received and heard, obey it, repent. If you do not wake up, I will come like a thief." What is the author saying? He's saying that they had fallen asleep, that they had sort of lulled themselves into lives of indifference, the status quo. They're playing it safe, and God wanted for them lives in which they would speak up and resist the temptation to play it safe. Maybe for you, sometime in your faith journey, you've done the same thing. You've played it safe. We have a God who says to people like you and me, hey, you don't need to play it safe. In fact, I invite you to speak up, and you'll know a life filled with abundance. The second church the chapter 3 addresses is the church in Philadelphia. Now, the church there was small, but it made up for its smallness, if you will, by its faith. It was a church that was persecuted heavily by both the Romans and the synagogue. In verse 8 of chapter 3, the second half of that verse, he writes these words, "I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name." You see, the church was persecuted. It was small. It was persecuted by big, bad Romans, the synagogue. And so here's what the author knew. The author knew that when we are persecuted, when we feel as though we are under the heavy weight, there are 2 temptations. The first temptation is to escape, to say, no way, I want out of here. And in fact, this chapter 3, specifically in verse 10, is where we get the kind of strange idea that maybe you've heard of before, this idea of the rapture. In chapter 3, verse 10, it says, "Because you have kept my word of patience, patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth." Many people throughout the ages have come up with this idea that verse suggests that we have a God who plucks those who are faithful up out of this world. It's the idea of this rapture. The second temptation is the temptation to sort of give up, to say, if I'm going to get persecuted, no way, I am done. Well, neither of those options are options that this God places on the table. Instead, this God, at the end of its message to the church in Philadelphia, says that God promises to be their strength, whatever they face. God doesn't pluck people out. God doesn't invite us to just give up. Society may view you as an outsider, but you're always an insider to this God. You see, God invites the people of Philadelphia to lives of endurance. And maybe for you at one time or another, you felt maybe not persecuted, but you felt as though you were an outsider because of your faith. God invites us to lives of endurance. The last church that the author writes to in chapter 3 is the church in Laodicea. And in Laodicea, it's a community that was wealthy. They had had an earthquake in the community, and they refused gold from Rome in order to rebuild their community. But here's what the author seems to suggest, that even though they were rich, Christ called them poor. In chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, he uses water as a way, hot and cold water, to describe the people of Laodicea. "I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I am about to spit you out of my mouth." What's he saying? Well, the people of Laodicea, they lived near a mountain spring. They knew cold, fresh water, right? But there was a Roman aqueduct that was built that brought warm water into the community, and that water sat and it would smell. It was putrid. It was nasty, people. Here's what the author is saying, that even though they were rich, they were poor, and compares them to this stenchy aqueduct water that would have filled the streets of that city. You see, they were lukewarm. They had lost their passion. God wanted them to live lives of passion. You see, maybe as we read through each of these churches, you hear maybe yourself in one of those churches. And so as we close today, this sort of walk through all the 7 churches that the author of the book of Revelation addresses through the words of Christ, here are a couple of questions for you. Which church do you most closely relate to? Which of those 7 do you most closely relate to, and why? And how are you challenged by reading this book and what Christ had to say to each and every one of those churches? Thanks so much for tuning in today. Hope you enjoy. Tune in tomorrow for our next edition of Making Sense of Revelation.